Hi, I'm Dave Adams, you're watching The Core Mechanic, and today we're doing a tech talk on deduction games. Hi, my name's Dave Adams, and I love playing games. At the 2015 PAX convention, one of my favourite game designers, Mike Selinka, presented his list of top 100 games you must absolutely, positively know how to play. The 100th game on the list was a challenge to play a game of my own design. With a desire to understand more about the hobby that I love so much, I've taken on that challenge to design a game. But first, I need to learn as much as I can about game design. I'm going to start by playing as many of the games on Mike's list as possible. Join me as I learn more about the core mechanic. Deduction games are hidden information games that require people to draw conclusions from a given premise or premises. Now, today we're going to try and hopefully break these down into some meaningful categories. The first, I suppose, big divide I think would be suitable to make was really the difference between abstract deduction games and thematic deduction games. Abstract deduction games include such games as poker, bridge, mastermind, and Zendo. Zendo raises some interesting problems for us already, and we'll get to the other games shortly. But in Zendo, the game master or the Zen master has a general rule for setting prisms out. And each player uses these little plastic prisms and tries to set theirs up. And the Zen master provides feedback to each person as to whether they're getting closer to the rule or further away from the rule. Now, without trying to get too caught up in describing the game, the problem that people raise out of that is they really believe that that's more inductive reasoning rather than deductive reasoning. The difference being that deductive tends to start with general information and work its way towards specific information, and inductive goes the other way, starting from specifics and trying to work out the general. So in Zendo, when you start with the specifics of the pyramids, you're trying to work out the general rule for setting them out. One of the other convoluted things that occur is that inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning tend to be cyclical. And so it's sometimes hard to know where one begins and the other ends. And in this case, for the most part, we just tend to say deductive reasoning, or at least deductive games. And that seems to satisfy most people, although you'll get the occasional word head who will want to try and argue the case. In which case, I say, let them have their win and just move on. Poker raises an interesting problem of its own as well. It is in fact a deductive reasoning game. You're sitting there trying to work out how much you should bet and whether you should go in on this pot or whatever, but the inductive reasoning not only occurs through looking at the cards and trying to work out what's the percentages of this card coming up and how many cards of this have already been gone through. So you could card count essentially, not that I'm encouraging that in casinos, but there's also the metagame going on, where the player, or the players for that matter, are trying to work out or trying to reason what the other players are doing. And so over the course of the game, they start to make inductive reasons and draw conclusions about given premises on each player. So for instance, tells in poker. People look at each other's tells, they try and look at the history of the player, they try to include that in their decision making. Now, would this player go all in if they thought they were going to lose it all? Or is this player someone who likes to bluff a lot? And bluffing itself adds some problems to the game because it tends to subvert or interfere with the information that people have been gathering over time. So the premises they draw still may or may not be incorrect. So inside of all this abstract reasoning, we've got issues with inductive and deductive, and we've got where is the inductive reasoning coming from? Is it coming directly from the game? Where a mastermind, it's all from the game. Or is it more the metagame in which the induction is occurring? This leads us into our next category of thematic games. So this includes the strongly thematic and very story-driven idea of deduction games, such as How to Host a Murder. How to Host a Murder involves people taking on character roles, and they have a certain amount of information, And the idea is over the course of the evening, as you share a meal and as you interact and you do different things, you try to work the story out. And at different points in the night, you stop and you have specific story events that try to push the story along. That's a strongly story-driven, thematic, deductive reasoning game. But not all games are that strong on story. There's far more, I suppose, loosely thematic games, such as Werewolf. Now, Werewolf only requires you to think through the concept of, well, there are werewolves in a town, and as town people, you're trying to deduct which ones or which people in your town are werewolves and are killing people off at night. And so you go through days and you go through night scenarios, and each time someone's dying. And the idea is that over time you're trying to limit down to killing off the werewolves as quickly as possible, which inevitably leads to citizens also killing citizens. The best thing about Werewolf is that it's also a strongly meta-driven game. Now, you could try and stick just within the confines of the group, but the reality is the deduction happens in the processing and the discussion and the challenging and people trying tactics and tricks to get people to give gives and tells away about who their character is and what's going on. Now, the next step from Werewolf would surely be the Resistance, and although there is a significant amount of metagame discussion that goes on in the Resistance, there's also the game giving you a lot more information as to who may or may not be a spy or, I suppose, the traitor within the group. So what it does is it takes you through a series of scenarios, and over time you might be able to logically deduce on the basis of who's been on what teams and when have teams failed as to who the traitors might be or who the spies might be within the group. Now, another game that might fit into the thematic, and I really struggled about whether to put it in here or not, was the game Guess Who. And I would say that in terms of a thematic sense where you're trying to identify the person that your opponent has selected, it's still very much a strongly game-driven deduction. It's pure deduction. It's you trying to systematically eliminate variables so as you can limit all your choices down to the one face so that you can effectively guess what the other person's who the other person has chosen. Now, an aside to all this difference between abstract and thematic style deduction games is also the way that deduction games might be structured. So you might have team-based deduction games such as the Resistance and Werewolf, where you've got two teams of people fighting off, or you might have deduction games which are one versus all. So Mastermind is a one versus all. More specifically, you could choose, say, Fury of Dracula, where one person plays Dracula and is trying to evade and obfuscate all of the other players on the Van Helsing's team. So you've got one person versus all, and the other teams are trying to deduce and trying to work out where Dracula is and track him down and hunt him down. Another good example is Letters of Whitechapel or Mr. Jack. Now, those games are directly oppositional. There are other games, and games which are becoming more popular even, that seem to have this hidden traitor element. Now, this means that deduction may or may not be an actual facet of the game, even though you need to use it every game to ensure whether it's needed or not. Let me explain. Games such as Battlestar Galactica, or even more specifically and more recently, Dead of Winter, are classic examples. Now, in Dead of Winter, you may or may not have a traitor. You don't actually know. So the challenge is you've got all this hidden information, you're trying to deduce whether people are supporting you or on the team or not. You're trying to deduce if there is in fact a traitor, and if there is a traitor, you want to get rid of the traitor, but you need to find out who the traitor is. And that leads to very strong elements of tension. Dead of Winter is also a strongly thematic game. Now, I can't imagine doing that sort of game, that sort of hidden traitor element, in an abstract game. And perhaps it works so well because it's in strongly thematic and story-based gaming. Now, one of the problems of these deductive games is that they can often come across, or at least feel, a little too random. And by that I mean that initially it's not really certain which decision to make, and so really any decision would do. Werewolf, when you start the game, say you have 15 people there, it's really unclear as to who the werewolves are. So in general, the first round of daytime where you're trying to lynch someone who you think might be a werewolf, in general is just about, well, let's just lynch someone and find out. It's not really clear, or there's not enough information to make any meaningful guesses at that time, unless you play with some people who I've played with who clearly can't stop giggling when they're the werewolf. Now, the other problem of this is games which are strongly deductive based on in-game play. So essentially it becomes a race through elimination. As an example, Cluedo. Now, as a kid, I really enjoyed Cluedo, but Cluedo was really only satisfactory for me until about 8, 9 years old, when suddenly I realized that there was a pattern, and I could just follow that pattern, and I could be relatively certain that so long as no one else was following the pattern, I would generally win. In fact, games like Mastermind, which are essentially the same, really tend to come across more as just puzzles to be solved. And that doesn't create the greatest tension in gaming. It isn't often the most interesting of games to play. Okay, here's a challenge for you. Games like Sheriff of Nottingham, Mysterium, Dixit, or even Concept, would you place them in the deduction game category? And if so, which subgroup would you put them under? How would you define them? I'd also love to hear your thoughts on which deduction games, if any, do you enjoy playing. I do enjoy deduction games myself. I tend to like the ones that include theme or story, but have that good balance between meta-game deduction as well as in-game deduction. So I do enjoy The Resistance as one of my favourite deduction games. It just has that balance, which I think is right, that there's enough in-game information giving me ideas of who might be what, but there's also the whole table discussion going on. The tricks and the plays and the things we say to try and get each other to give some sort of tell away as to which team they might be supporting. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching. I'm Dave Adams. This has been a Tech Talk. You're watching The Core Mechanic. Would love to see you next time. Have a great one. Bye. Thanks for watching. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What style of deduction game do you enjoy most and why?